Hello, good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are in the world. This is Frank McNally, Director of Learning and Content Development at Public Spend Forum. Really excited to have you all today for a very exciting session, a topic that's very close to my heart, Agile Acquisitions for Digital Services in Government. I'm going to give a minute or two for people to hop on, because I realize now I've given that introduction and there's probably only about 4 people that were on to hear it. So you might hear it again. But let's go ahead and get settled. I think people are coming in to our session. It is just at the top of the hour. So sit tight. We're going to get started here in a moment, because I know it can take a little time for folks to get in and get acclimated. So we'll be right with you in just a moment. All right. Ooh, I see some fun folks in the chat. What's up, Kiana? How are we doing? Good to hear from you. I do want to say this is going to be a pretty open-ended session. I think we've got some great content, but we do want to hear questions from you all. So please drop them in the chat, drop them in the Q&A. If you don't know how to do that, I wonder if you can figure that out by just drop your cursor to the bottom of the Zoom screen and it'll pull up a little panel. I was going to make a funny comment about if you don't know how to work virtual meetings by now, I wonder where you've been for the last 14 months, but I pulled that punch and then delivered it as a role anyway. So, all right, enough of me jabbering. Let's get into it. Our topic today is Agile Acquisitions for Digital Services in Government. I'm just going to be moderating this panel. We've got 2 real experts with us, and I want to introduce them. So Dave, let's hop on to the next slide. And Dave is really the founder of the Feast, the principal at Packaged Agile. You put this all together for us, and so we're excited to have it. And then we're also joined by Jonathan Mostowski, definitely one of the leading voices in civic digital services today, a founding member at Rebellion Defense, and the president of Agile Acquisitions Consulting. Gentlemen, I will let you give your own introductions, and then Dave, you can hop into our programming.
Right. So thanks for that, Frank. I'll go very briefly. I have been fortunate enough to work with Jonathan over the past few years, and frankly, a lot of what I have learned about Agile Acquisitions has been through his help. So I'm a big Jonathan fan and feel pretty good about the crew that we've got together to talk about this. So I've been doing consulting to the government, coaching to the government for about 25 years or so now. And my background is agility. I was certified to train in Agile by Dr. Jeff Sutherland. Some of you may know him. He was one of the authors of the Agile Manifesto, and he's also a co-creator of Scrum. So my experience has been a number of agencies. I think I've been at about 10 now over the years, currently over at Agriculture, been at Homeland Security, Justice, FDIC, and Department of Veterans Affairs. So Jonathan?
Great, thanks. Frank, I got to work on my radio voice. That, I don't know, I feel a little unequal to your booming.
Oh, come on.
So I'm
sure I didn't set a bar or anything like that.
It's a little too high, but I'll do my best. Yeah, so I'm really excited to be here. Anyone who knows me knows that this topic is near and dear to my heart as well. My background, I was a contracting officer at NGA for about 13 years. I had the great fortune in the last about half of my time there to oversee the application service contracts with software development around the same time that the director, Tish Long, declared NGA would be a safe organization, which meant I got to learn really, really fast on the job what works and what doesn't. And after running a series of experiments, came up with some theories and tested them. And that resulted in OFPP asking me to co-author what became the TechFAR handbook. And then just a series of fortunate events that resulted in me getting recruited over to the early days of the US Digital Service. I spent 4.5 years with USDS and DDS, working on everything from policy to legislation to many, many acquisitions across the civil and defense space. And then about 2 years ago, I left to help start up Rebellion Defense, and I've been there since as it's a product and service company focused on DoD IC, and I lead the contracting and bureaucracy hacking activities there.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you to you both. I'm going to kick us off and get us started here by introducing Tasha. This is Tasha, as I say, our U.S. government program manager. We decided we would take you through sort of a real world scenario to learn about Agile Acquisitions here. So Tasha, very good at her job. She gets lots of work as a result, right? People know they can go to her to get things done. So her boss just asked her to take the lead on a new assignment. And what it is she's going to help build a new citizen relationship management solution so that the government can track a new benefits program for its veterans. So she's got to move faster than as usual. At her agency, we'll see some other timeframes here, but her agency, for doing an acquisition like this, often takes somewhere in the neighborhood of 12 to 20 months. She needs to cut that in half, and she still needs to get the work done right. She needs a vendor to help her with that. So she's anxious, but certainly she's willing to try new things. So let's follow Tasha through this process and see how she can use Agile Acquisitions to achieve her objectives. And let me just turn my laser pointer here as we move forward. Great. All right, so first, what's digital services? So Tasha has been through a number of programs. She's been around the block a few times, but this is still a relatively new term, and people use it in a lot of different ways. So let's define it. She asks us, and we say, look, here's our super simple definition. It's any service that really involves software. And nowadays, that's a ton of stuff. So her veteran benefit tracking system will be software focused. Everything involved in getting it in is also software focused. So hosting the new system. Maybe she's going to use Amazon Web Services, Google Cloud, Microsoft. Installing and configuring the software, something she needs a vendor to help her do. Building interfaces, testing, cybersecurity. All of these things are aspects of what we'll call digital services, just to keep it easy. So we're going to launch a poll here and hear from you very quickly. Let me see if I can't launch that. Launch polling. Oops, relaunch polling. Okay, so there should be a poll popping up for all of you. If you can go through and answer the first question, pretty simple. Have you participated in something that the government called an Agile acquisition? Maybe they called it a rapid acquisition or an innovative acquisition as well. Who has participated in something like that? Just a quick yes, no. We'll give you some time. And if you haven't, not a problem. Now, if you have, we'll ask you to complete part 2. And part 2 just goes through some statements that we find are often the case included in these so-called agile or innovative acquisitions. And I'm going to run through them real quickly because I'm going to ask, even for those of you who have not been through this before, just to keep these statements in mind as we move through the presentation about Agile Acquisitions and give you a flavor for our views on these things. Did the results end up meeting your expectations? Did we have in those acquisitions 50 or more mandated requirements? For our evaluation, when we evaluated the vendors, was it primarily focused on the vendor's written proposal and pricing? After award, did vendors give us working software that we could interact with fairly soon after they got started, within a couple months? Was there a detailed schedule and scope that was agreed to either at in the proposal phase sometimes, or very near to the start of the work itself? Did you have a separate testing team, something we often see? And or change requests needed to reprioritize the work? So look those over. I'll give you just another second or two to finish that up, and then we'll show you the results. It looks like a number of you are still voting. Appreciate that. Now, again, if you haven't been a part of an agile or rapid or innovative acquisition, not a problem. We're going to talk you through the principles as we go. We just want to get a flavor for where everybody is. I'll give you just another second or two. We're going to cut it off. We have a good majority of you participate, so thank you. All right, I'm going to end polling and just share the results. So this is great. We've actually got a good number of folks, 45%, who have not, but over 50% of you have participated in something called an Agile acquisition. That's often more than we see. So that's fantastic. Now, I'm not going to go through the second part of the poll in details now. We will show you as we go through our views on some of these situations about where they fit in what we're going to call Agile acquisitions. All right, so let me shut that down and move forward. Okay, so Tasha knows she's got two primary needs as she goes through this process. The first one is she needs to buy services that are going to deliver the value she's expecting, right? Her leaders, Congress, the veterans, they're expecting whatever she helps lead and build to work properly. And second, we talked about she needs to get those services faster than her agency typically is going to deliver them. 12 to 20 months is just too long. Now, she'll get what I'll call bonus points if the solutions are also relatively cheap, relatively inexpensive compared to alternatives, if we can compare apples to apples, and fairly easy. Is the buying process fairly efficient? While still complying with laws and regulations. We know we need to do that. I want to be clear though, following all the laws and regulations perfectly to the T, but not getting the value, not getting the right solution, and not getting it fast is not something that's considered a success from her leadership's point of view. So she has to get it fast and get it right. If she doesn't and she's perfect on these bonus points, she gets no credit for that. Unfortunately, we have way too many acquisitions today in government that just don't deliver the value that's expected. So many of them are late, over budget. Some are considered complete failures. And there's a number of reasons why. We'll go through some of them. But one is that we probably aren't evaluating vendors as effectively as we can. So we're going to talk about ways to do that better. Another could be how we go through the market research and solicitation process. We'll talk about engaging vendors in that. And then finally, that's what this last one over here speaks to. Industry metrics basically suggest, and we're famous for this in government, asking for hundreds, even thousands of requirements. And then unfortunately, there is a portion of what we end up building and testing that never ends up getting used or used very, very infrequently. The industry metrics are somewhere between 25 to 50% as infrequently or never used. Now, if we were at least getting the right things, maybe we'd be willing to wait a little longer. But unfortunately, even when we're not, the current process is pretty slow. Tasha talked about earlier, 12 to 20 months. That's not unusual. It depends on the size of the acquisition. There's lots of different factors, but it's common to take 1 to 3 years to go through this process. So to support that a little bit, here are some quotes from GSA 18F. Basically highlighting that study they quoted was that 87% of government projects that cost over $6 million, so not even that large, are late, they're over budget, or they delivered less scope than expected. On the right side is from the Air Force. They have a lot of big projects. So 8.5-year cycle time means from the start they started an acquisition, from the start they had a need to when something was delivered, on average is 8.5 years. So obviously these are really big projects. And they found, partially because of that, the amount of time that it took, that's right around 40% of the projects didn't end up delivering anything. That's tens of millions of dollars, sometimes more, that at the end of the program that gets canceled, we don't have anything to show for it. And one of the big reasons for this, and one of the reasons why we'll harp on that speed, that agility matters, is because needs change. If you take 8 years to deliver something, technology changes, leadership changes, they have different priorities. So getting speed with our value delivery is really, really important. So here's Tasha here. She knew there were challenges. She didn't know the numbers were that bad. Obviously, she's still smiling. So she's optimistic, though, that we can help her do better. So let's look at Agile Acquisitions and how we plan to do that. All right, so I want to be upfront. There is no single right definition for what constitutes an agile or innovative acquisition. We think this one is pretty good, though. If you don't, it starts with Lean Agile concepts. If you don't know much about Lean Agile, perfectly fine. We are actually going to walk you through and show you examples and principles. Oh, and Jonathan's holding up the Lean Startup, Eric Rice, for some of that. We're going to help you understand those principles, though, as they apply to acquisitions. I'm going to turn it over to Jonathan in a second. Before I do, though, I want to highlight one thing here that he'll talk about in detail, that these acquisition methods we're going to include here are both legal and encouraged. A lot of people feel like we're doing something new, we're doing something risky, and that's not really the case. So let me go to the next slide and I'll turn it over to Jonathan just to talk through that.
Great. Thanks, Dave. Yeah, so actually in the early days of sort of the agile movement, as I like to think about it, this was the real question. It was, yeah, we need to buy IT better, we get it, but you just can't in the FAR. And the Tech FAR handbook that I mentioned earlier was the first OMB publication on how you can do these things within the FAR, DFAR, and other regulations and policies. And this is not an all comprehensive list, but this is some of my favorite highlights from the FAR and beyond of where exactly you're not only allowed to, but in many cases encouraged. The Klinger-Cohen Act 1996, and specifically FAR Part 39, one of my favorite sections of the FAR is acquisition of IT, and FAR Part 39.1 is modular IT acquisition. So long before anyone was talking about doing agile iterative contracts, the FAR had already provided for that functionality in encouraging the use of modular contracts. FAR Part 37.6, another one I love. I actually wrote my MBA thesis on FAR 37.6 because I'm that much of a nerd. But that's performance-based service contracting. Not only is it encouraged, it's actually required to use when appropriate. And that's actually data that is tracked. And performance-based service contracting is agile contracting. That's where you get your SUE documentation. That's where you get your quality assurance surveillance plans. That's where you get which essentially SLAs come out of. This is everything that's in that section is the blueprint for how agile contracts can be, and in my opinion, most often should be. Another fantastic section of the FAR, Part 10, I think that really distinguishes agile acquisitions from traditional contracting is market research. Most of the limitations, which some of the other slides we'll get to, in being innovative in contracts is perceived but not reality, right? It's believed to be the case. And the way the government conducts market research, if you actually look at FAR Part 10, we are only scratching the surface of what's available to us. And agile contracts really pushes the envelope for that. FAR Part 12, someone in the Q&A or chat asked about SaaS, does it apply? I mean, this is commercial contracts. I don't think we want to limit the conversation to just agile software development services. Commercial products, COTS, SaaS solutions, in my opinion, all fall into this bucket of how we transform delivering the best capabilities to the government, the taxpayers, and the end users. Also 13.5 simplified acquisitions for commercial, which isn't up here, but follows off of that. And then, of course, where would we be without 1.102 in our definitions, where if the FAR doesn't say you can't, then you can. When I learned that early in my days of contracting, it just opened my mind and my eyes. And every time someone told me I couldn't, my first question was show me exactly where it says I can't. The Tech FAR handbook is out there, it's still available, but the Tech FAR hub is sort of the next generation of it where you can actually interact and get live documentation, samples, tools, all sorts of wonderful bits of information to kind of help self-direct your learning and move down the path to do this stuff. In addition to that, anyone who follows me on LinkedIn knows I'm a huge fan of the Armed Service Committee. The work on the NDAAs since 2016 have revolutionized the possibilities on what we can do with software acquisitions. And there's so much in there that we're just not taking advantage of, and many that we are. And it's important to remember that, I always say, don't be so agile that you're not agile. There's a lot of beliefs on what are the best contract types, what are the best vehicles to use, what works, what doesn't work. The reality is I've used all of them. They all can work. It largely comes down to the program office, the contractor, and the contracting office, and which ones they are going to be able to work best in. But you should never think you're absolutely limited by the types that are of contracts that you've heard most commonly used. Next slide, Dave.
All right. Well, so Jonathan just kind of highlighted, there's all these places in the FAR and the regulations that say the laws and the regulations, frankly, aren't really the problem. So what is? And this is a survey that was done a few years ago of government acquisition professionals who are interested in innovation. And they highlighted 3 top issues. The number one issue wasn't the FAR, it was poor collaboration. It was, by this they mean the contracting people, the program staff, the IT staff, the vendors weren't collaborating very effectively, both pre-award and post-award. So through the acquisition process and during delivery. Number 2 was education. So we had about half the people basically say, look, people don't understand what the laws and regulations allow. And when they don't, they tend to revert back to old habits, which feel safe. And they may feel safe, but I think one of the things that we're highlighting with some of the statistics is that the track record of delivering value for those, quote, safe methods isn't so great. And by safe, I don't mean skilled agile framework. I mean things that people are comfortable with. And then finally, misaligned incentives. And this absolutely is a challenge. We have contracting professionals that are often strongly encouraged to use old school methods because there's a lot of belief that that'll help avoid protests. And it's what they're familiar with. We have program offices that are focused on mission results. They want to get things done quickly. And IT is focused on those things as well, but they have additional responsibilities to make sure that we are focused on the right target architecture. They need to make sure the application is secure. Are we meeting cybersecurity requirements, compliance with best practices? They know they're going to have to get through phase gate reviews. So are we in good shape to do that? And this is where lean and agile principles that we'll share, we're very lucky. They're really very good at addressing some of these challenges like collaboration, like misaligned incentives. We have a number of events, techniques that we use to address these issues. So we're very familiar with them. So what I want to leave you with here is let's just, I think what Jonathan was saying, let's not just assume that the FAR is in the way. Yes, there's requirements. Yes, there's regulations, but with somebody who knows their way around it, we can find ways to get done things that we still think are agile while being compliant with the FAR.
Hey, Dave, can I just jump in one real quick on that?
Absolutely.
I believe this all comes down to innovation, and my definition of innovation, my personal sort of ethos for innovation, is it comes down to assuming things could or should be done differently, having a deep understanding of the rules and regulations that surround the thing you are looking at, and then responsible risk-taking. And you can't do responsible risk-taking without having an understanding of the rules and regulations. And so this really lays out understanding why it's so important to understand what you can and can't do, because once you realize that, then really the blue sky is ahead of you.
Awesome.
And quickly, before we jump off sort of the regulatory questions and maybe some definitions, we did have a question from the audience about whether, in the opinion of the panelists, there are any differences between Agile and modular contracting, or is that really just nomenclature?
Want me to take that, Dave? Yeah, sure.
Sure.
Largely, it's nomenclature. So modular literally means in pieces. Agile does not literally mean in pieces, but often is. So modular contracting, as it's encouraged in the FAR, is to use shorter periods of performance. And the real intent behind that section is to avoid what Dave highlighted earlier, which is 8.5-year-long programs are not representative of the maturation of technology. That's what modular contracting was getting at. That's a core value of Agile development, but it's not necessarily a complete synonym. We typically use modular contracting in Agile development for several reasons. One of which is because you're taking the requirements out of the upfront acquisition piece to some extent. The contractual requirements stay, but the technical requirements move out of the contract itself in most cases. There is a perceived risk of like, well, how do I know I'm going to get anything? And one of the mitigations of those risks, especially when you're talking about culture change and inspiring leaders to take these sort of challenges, is letting them know that there's off ramps. So we're not signing you up for $100 million for 10 years. We're going to do 6-month periods of performance or limit the contract to 3 years broken up into some reasonable subsection. So modular is a key component of it in most cases, but it's not exactly the same thing.
And to Jonathan's point, we actually do have a slide in a few minutes we'll show you where that kind of modular small chunk contracting is maybe 1/12 of the principles that we'd advise that you consider when trying to do Agile contracting. But Jonathan, I think this is you as well. Good transition maybe into traditional versus Agile acquisitions, what the process may look like.
Sure. So the traditional acquisition process, 9 months to 36 months. I've seen them go much longer, believe it or not. And maybe I'll share a story about that a little bit later in this session. But the traditional acquisition process is most encumbered and most challenged by the attempt to gather requirements up front. So put yourself in the shoes of someone who is going to build the next generation cell phone. And if you are going to try to think to yourself, what are all the use cases of this phone 5 years from now? In reality, you probably couldn't do it 6 months from now, and certainly not more than a year out. But that's exactly what the government does. And it does it as a risk mitigation because the belief is, and oftentimes we're talking about FAR 15, there's many other sections of the FAR that get into different types of contracting structures. But when we're talking about traditional acquisition for IT, it most often occurred under FAR Part 15, acquisition by negotiation, which you don't actually negotiate in. It's a terrible name for that section. But the reality is that section is the most widely used part of the FAR for large IT acquisitions, and as a result has the most significant amount of case law surrounding it. And case law is as instructive and important as law or statutory law. So the idea is, well, if we're going to go through this acquisition and we know it's going to take us probably 12 months to make award, and we're going to have to live with the outcome for 5 years, so that's 6 years, we need to get all of these things into the bucket because it's really difficult to go back and modify and change the scope. So they go through this cycle of trying to talk to everybody, and they don't. The user research is not, well, in most cases, what we would consider the modern approaches to user research, but they talk to stakeholders, they try to gather these requirements, and then they produce a significant document that contains everything they can imagine. And then they have to get that approved. So now you have this 50 to 100 page, I remember 500 page system requirement documents very vividly in my past. And those documents have to be reviewed and approved, and a month is generous there. In that same process, you also have your acquisition package. So your acquisition strategy, your source selection plan, all of these documents that say how you're going to do your acquisition. And these documents are really important because most protests that are sustained because someone did not adhere to the source selection plan as they said they would. They did something or didn't do something that they said they would. So that process being a month is as generous as you get. Then you go out for your proposal process, you put it on the street. With a couple ways you could slice this: 15 days for synopsis, 30 days for solicitation. So that's 45 days. In some instances, you can combine those. 45 days alone on solicitation if it's for R&D. And that would assume you didn't get any questions or changes that were substantive enough to require you to alter the solicitation. If you do, then you have to, one, review all those questions. I've been on acquisitions where we received upwards of 200 questions. They have to be reviewed. If you make changes, those changes have to be reviewed and approved. And then you have to go back out and give industry more time to respond. And so very often 2 months is a reasonable expectation for the proposal process. Finally, proposals come in and it's evaluation time. I have nightmares of being locked away in certain buildings for months and months on end, doing evaluations, eating horrible food, horribly unhealthy food. And you are just heads down in these proposals, evaluating each of them. And then you have to come together and agree, consensus as it's called. And oftentimes that goes through many, many iterations before you reach a final conclusion. And because there's no down selection process, there might be 2 vendors, there might be 20, and you have to do the same thing for every single one. Even if one of those vendors never had a chance of winning, just completely missed the mark, you still have to do the same due diligence on them. Then finally, you have vendor selection, which includes notifications and debriefs and holding your breath to find out whether or not there is a protest and if that protest has a stay. And that's not even getting into the timeframes of what happens if there is. So there's your time frame. The numbers represented up here, I would describe as best case scenario. Next slide, slide magic. I don't know how you do that, but that's cool. So we'll compare that to Agile Acquisitions, Innovative Acquisitions, Modular Acquisitions, however you want to refer to it. The idea here is we accept what we don't know, and we don't attempt to try to create something that is permanent. We're not pouring concrete, we're pouring sand. We're building a framework from which I like to think of, especially for software development acquisitions, we're acquiring the factory. So we're not saying everything that the factory is going to produce. We're buying how the factory produces the output of software or code or functional product is how I like to refer to it. So therefore, the acquisition requirements can be significantly less time. I mean, I've done these in far less than a month. I've written statements of objectives and RFPs in a day for these sort of acquisitions. But we'll go with 3 months just to be generous. And that is bringing together the statement of objective. Oftentimes the performance work statement, if there will be one, will occur on the back end post-selection. It also greatly simplifies the source selection plan and acquisition strategy, especially if you're using a down selection process. And correct me if I'm wrong, Dave, but I think we get into that in a later slide, so I won't spend the time here. And then, actually, we have the proposal workshops and evaluations, which is often part of that down selection process. So now, instead of having N number of submissions, all of which receive the same treatment, you are whittling down to a more reasonable and more likely vendor pool, and you're not throwing documents over the wall. It's a dynamic evaluation process that allows you to get a deeper understanding of the vendors, but also happens much quicker. And then ultimately a vendor selection. And of course, you still have the same debriefs and notification periods involved there. So significantly faster. Again, 50% is being generous and accounting for maybe the bureaucracy of an organization that isn't as familiar with this. So there we go. Okay. I swear I've seen these slides before. Next slide. Okay. So this is really diving in a little bit deeper into what I was just alluding to. So earlier I mentioned FAR Part 10 market research being so critically important to the secret sauce of Agile Acquisitions. And that's because when the government just comes up with an idea, and when I say just come up, that's that 7 month or more of pulling together requirements, and then posts a draft RFP of 50 to 100 pages and all of the associated documents with it, and then has vendors ask questions and respond to an RFI. That's just the surface of market research. But if you do markets research right, not only can you inform yourself who are the capable vendors out there and who's interested, but you can also help vendors self-select if they're not interested. If you lump 100,000 different requirements into an opportunity, then a vendor is kind of left in a situation that's set for 5 or 10 years. They're left in a situation where they may not think they're the best vendor for all of it, but if they don't get their piece of this acquisition, they're locked out of the part they are interested in for 5 or 10 years. And so having these dialogues and conversations and really tailoring the acquisition allows a manageable list of actual capable vendors. Move over to item 2, the capability build, demo, and conversations. This can take all sorts of forms. You can actually do something like a challenge or a test bed where vendors can demonstrate their capabilities in the case of existing technology. Or you can do tech challenges is common, where you'll give vendors a problem statement and they'll have a very fixed period of time, 1 day, 4 days, a week, to build a representative capability and map out their process. Because again, if what you're buying is the factory, once you've established that they can create capable functional, or they're capable of producing functional products, then really what you want to understand is what is their process for doing so and how do they handle stress that will inevitably occur during the process. Moving over to item 3, evaluate both product and team process to down select. The commercial solutions opening, which was authorized under NDA 2019 as part of the other transaction authority, was then expanded in NDA 2020 to non-OTA, or in other words, FAR-based contracts. And that's essentially what we're talking about here, is where you post a statement of need. Vendors come in essentially with a white paper. You can down select from the white paper process, and then you will move into potentially the tech challenge and further down select that pool of vendors to, in some cases, 1 or 2 vendors to actually move forward in the acquisition. And then down to item 4, awarding simplified acquisitions, not the same as simplified acquisitions as referred to in FAR Part 13 necessarily, but in many cases it can be. This could be any kind of simplified acquisition, just meaning acquisitions that are less complicated. But you have one option is to actually award more than one contract for a very short period of performance and actually pay the vendors for their time to build initial capabilities, very, very nascent initial capabilities to further evaluate the most effective offer. And then finally over to item number 5, select, collaboratively, work together. I love this. Someone asked a question in the Q&A, I answered it, and then I saw it got posted in the chat and I didn't answer it. So I'm not sure which one people can see, but when you think of like budgets, budgets are like, bring me a rock. If I don't tell you how much money I have, but I tell you to bring me this sort of innovative software development factory, you don't know if that's a 7-person team or a 12-person team. You're just going to guess. And the same thing is true when the government writes a PWS, a performance work statement. They're dictating the solution. They're not getting industry's best ideas. They're getting industry's best reflection of the government's ideas. And so when you move this process to the end and you say, we're going to start with a statement of need or perhaps a statement of objectives, and we're going to move the actual SLAs and maybe entire performance work statement to a collaborative discussion. This is like back in the old days, if you will, we would call alpha negotiations, where you would sit down in a very hot, ugly government room and like negotiate with a contractor to get an output that the contractor can reasonably deliver on and the government understands and it matches their objectives. So putting it down here is, in my opinion, another very essential ingredient to doing Agile acquisitions correctly. Next slide.
Awesome. Thanks, Jonathan. Well, so we mentioned earlier, and there was a question about this, the question was about modular contracting. Is that all this is? And I think we would argue there's certainly more to it than that. One of the areas, a key area, is certainly thinking small and modular. And that is something the government struggles to do because we've got a lot of money to spend. And some of these products are complicated. So we have this list of principles that we can apply in lots of cases. What we're going to do is we'll talk through a few of these now, and then over the following slides, we're going to discuss where some of the others came from and how we might use them. So yes, we've touched on this first principle already. Jonathan just talked about some examples of what don't tell me, show me looks like. And we got an AK here of working products beat paper. So Jonathan talked about, let's say we got 20, 30 vendors who bid on something. It's reasonably complicated. Maybe this product that we were talking about for Tasha, where we've got a 30-page technical and management proposal that the vendors submit. And then they've got resumes, they have past performance, of course, the price proposal. We may end up looking at 70, 80, even 100 pieces of paper for each vendor that we've got to look at. And if we have 25 or 30 vendors, we could easily need to be evaluating thousands of pieces of paper. So we can often cut that down, like the example that he showed, if we focus a little bit more on working products. And the other thing here is we have to remember there's a lot of push to use small businesses. Large businesses, it can be true of small businesses as well, but the large businesses often have these proposal shops. And I've been part of some of those businesses. We have people who did these beautiful graphics and the proposals and everything was compliant. It looked gorgeous. So we're often wowed by them, right? It's hard not to be. But as Jonathan showed, there's lots of ways we can integrate the show me principles into our acquisition where we're not just focused on paper. The second one that I want to touch on very briefly is, because this is often overlooked, is that we really need government support. And this sounds like something that we would say is, after the acquisition, after the award, but I'll tell you, we need to plan for it during the acquisition process. We need to stop assuming the vendor can be successful without us, and we, the government, are a critical part of the equation. So in good agility, we'll often train government staff to play a role that's often called either a product manager or product owner. And that person gets embedded with the vendor team. They help prioritize work, they help get feedback, they approve work, and they help us address challenges every day. It's an absolutely essential role. Ideally, it would be full-time. And for larger projects, it often is. Even part-time embedded support is better than no support. But that is something we need to plan for early in the acquisition phase so that it's not an afterthought when we get into delivery. And Jonathan, before we move forward, any of these you want to touch on?
Sure. I will. How about story time? I'll talk about think small and modular since that came up in a question. So I will refrain from naming the agency to protect the innocent and guilty alike. But one of the fun tasks of digital service is getting to go out to different agencies when they're in trouble. And either they've raised their own hand and said they're in trouble, or someone else has raised their hand and said they're in trouble. But I had the opportunity to go to an organization that was pursuing a very, very large IT acquisition tied to some statutory mandates. And, when I went there, I did what you do in the sort of discovery phase of digital service work, which is just kind of took it all in, talked to everybody. What are you trying to do? What's the outcome? So on and so forth. And just to put in context, about a $500 million acquisition for 5 years to deliver a technical functionality. If I get any more specific than that, you'll be able to connect the dots. So I remember I went in one day and all the big staunchy table, everybody in suits, I'm in a hoodie and a t-shirt, and I go and I sit down at the table and they're basically presenting their $500 million plan to the leadership of the organization. And I interrupted and I just said, hey, how long do you think this acquisition is going to take you? Like, when are you going to put it on the street? And they said, oh, we're going to have this on the street in 12 to 24 months. So in 2 years from that point, after all that work had been put into it, they would get it on the street for a $500 million acquisition. And I said, okay, so just back of napkin numbers here, you're looking at around 400 FTEs per year. 400 FTEs per year. Let that sink in. And the room got really silent and everybody kind of looked at each other. And then finally someone spoke up and said, no, actually, I think it's a little bit more than that. And I was stunned. Everybody else was nodding like, this is great. And so I just point out, I was like, there is no way you need 400 people to deliver capability. Like that's, maybe at some point it gets there, but you don't need to start there. Of course, everybody got very upset. This was their plan. Leadership was there. This was probably not the best place to point out their plan was not good. So I offered an alternative. I said, hey, I think you should start with an 8A company and something very, very small, deliver initial capabilities and go from there. They said, no, we can't do that. We got 12 months to 24 months to get this on the street. I said, okay, give me $250,000 in 6 months and I will have a working MVP in production. So, and I said, if it works, you have to abandon this $500 million strategy and move to what, well, I'll say that to the end, and move to the strategy I was ultimately recommending. So to shut me up and get me out of the room, they agreed to it. We ended up within 3 months having an 8A contractor on contract and delivered the initial MVP. And as a result, they completely pivoted their entire strategy to a multi-award IDIQ of agile development contractors, which became the strategy for the organization going forward. And they saved hundreds of millions of dollars and still met their legislative timelines, which they probably wouldn't have done under their original plan. So that's just one example, and that is everywhere. So I'll leave that there.
Awesome. So, it's funny too, Jonathan, I hadn't put this together, but that story also dovetails into this one, which we're going to cover in a minute, which is, look, more people is not necessarily better. Frankly, we find in good agility, fewer people often, especially to start, makes a lot more sense. So I love that story. All right.
Jonathan, we had a quick follow-up. Did you use just a traditional 8A set aside for that contract, or did you have commercial solution opportunity or opening opportunity authority, CSO?
In that particular instance, because of the importance of getting an MVP in hand, we did a direct 8A sole source to a known 8A company that was really good at delivering agile software.
And what we're going to see here is still supportive of what Jonathan talked about. I won't go too deep into coders, but there's at least been some studies showing that even with similar years of experience, there's huge differences between what people can produce in a short amount of time. And in some of these studies, they looked at 1,000% difference between how long it took somebody to code or configure something versus what somebody else in maybe the bottom quartile took. And I bring this up. This isn't just about software coders. This is true about any of our team members. We've got Steve Jobs here talking a little bit about, he saw some of the same things in other domains where the best people could be 50 or 100 times better than an average player. So this speaks to coming up with smaller teams of really, really strong players, hopefully, if nothing else, to get things kicked off. And part of the reason why, a couple examples, right? These are very visible examples. Healthcare.gov, they had hundreds of people. They had vendors who had done this many times before. They went through a very careful selection process. And I won't say that it was only 10 people who fixed it, but it's pretty documented at this point that there was a very small number, roughly 10, credited with an outsized role in making it better. There's actually some TEDx, I think, videos about this and the US Digital Services and how they related. And then we've got the FBI Sentinel Program. This one, even a little more pointed. They spent $500 million, not just in one trial. This is after 9/11. They wanted to improve their systems. They had 2 different attempts. Both of them failed over the course of 7 years. And in the second one, they had 300 plus people, right? So like Jonathan was talking about, lots of people, lots of smart people. They downsized to fix it. So it wasn't one team, but certainly they got smaller as a way to focus and to try to make sure they were building little chunks of value as they went. And it ended up helping quite a bit. So another reason for getting smaller, here's Tasha again, is some statistics in the industry. This is by these Standish groups, basically showing, and we do this in government, right? Some of the challenges with those big failures are that they worked in these big batches. They didn't release little bits of capability very frequently. And why I bring that up is because the study Standish did showed that the failure rate, and we saw this earlier with the Air Force, the failure rate for these really big programs, almost 40%. That means they spent millions, tens of millions, didn't get anything into production as a result. And then you've got challenge, these are the ones that are late, they're over budget. Over here, though, if you kept programs small, and small, I think in this study meant like $1 million or smaller, your success rates go way up. Your outright failure rates fall through the floor. We're talking, a 10 to 1 difference here. And obviously, this is where Tasha knows she wants to be over here. How does this apply, though, right? In the government, we've got these big programs, we've lots of requirements we need to get done. When we're doing effective agility, part of what we're doing is chunking up the work in ways that we can make large projects far more similar to small projects. We are delivering things in chunks like Jonathan talked about. We hopefully get something into production, users interact with it, we get feedback, and maybe we reprioritize as we go. So really important that we do think small. Getting things into production early, or at least potentially releasable to production, has a huge risk reduction benefit, something that clearly didn't happen on like healthcare.gov. And then we talked earlier about if everything's a priority, nothing is. So picking those things, and we're really good in this in agility, force ranking items so that there's only one number one priority. We work on some of those top priorities before moving on to the other 900 potential requirements. All right, so we've introduced some of this. Doesn't seem real complicated, right? But we always get the question that, well, then why don't our staff know how to do this already? Because it's not that complicated. And earlier we showed this. We showed sort of our 3 big barriers to government acquisitions. We've presented the examples. The number one reason I think that people don't know how to do this already is that everyone's super busy. Right? We're not spending a ton of time in the grand scheme of things helping them learn and get comfortable with what this is all about. Some of you may have heard about the DITAP program. I won't go into that in detail. Frank was actually teaching class in that earlier today. That's when you're going to make a 6-month commitment to actually going through this and learning. And frankly, I think that's a lot more of what's required. It takes a big investment because this is complicated. So what kind of support do we need to teach folks and to do it better? You can certainly enroll in the DITAP program, and a little plug, I'm sure Frank can tell you more about that. I think Jonathan helped create some of the materials for that program as well. There are other options as well, though. And this is why when in good agility, we often have a focus on what we'll call coaching. I won't go through this in detail, but at a high level, typically when we train somebody, we're over here. This is a study from McKinsey and IBM. We go through some classroom training, and then in 3 months, if it was simple content, we might recall about 10% of what we learned. Obviously, acquisitions and doing it in an agile way isn't simple content. So our retention or proficiency is going to be probably a lot lower than that. The way we get more proficiency, the way we get more, give people the ability to do this is sitting side by side with them and helping them. And this is what we've tried to do, more of a coaching stance, which is something, again, good agile programs do. So we sit with the contracting officers and we help them through the process in a real world, not even real world scenarios, in their actual scenarios, and help them with the acquisitions so they learn how to do it. After they've done that a couple times, again, you can still do some light coaching, helping them out from time to time, but in general, they'll have a pretty good feel for how this works. and be able to do it effectively. So if that sounds like a lot of work and hand-holding, I think it is. I do think there are places even within government that are doing this, at least to some degree, effectively today. I think Bill Pratt has, I don't know if he's on, he has drawn my attention to the DHS Procurement Innovation Lab. And I think they do something similar. They publish some of their results. They have teams of coaches that go out and help acquisition teams do this effectively, which I think is really where we need to go as the government, and for me as a contractor who helps the government do this. All right, so anyone familiar with the Department of Defense paper called Detecting Agile BS? Yes, maybe throw that into the chat if you are. I am guessing yes. It looks like some of you probably are familiar with this. I love the very in-your-face title. Congrats to the Department of Defense. We've taken the same concept and applied it to Agile Acquisitions. So before I show you our Agile Acquisition BS detector, I want to call out, this is of course just our view, and it's meant to poke some fun at the process. If you're doing some of these things, please don't feel bad. They are still the norm. And as we just went through, we really need to invest in the type of coaching we talked about to get out of these situations. So that said, here's Tasha. We've explained to Tasha that if she wants to get an effective Agile acquisition that's going to work well, get her the results she needs, there are some things she wants to avoid. I'll say a common approach to Agile acquisitions is what I like to call the pixie dust approach. And some of you may have seen this before. What it means is that people take existing acquisition material, they've used it in the past, maybe it's a statement of work or statement of objectives, and they liberally sprinkle the words Agile, Scrum, Safe, DevOps, maybe DevSecOps into the text, and then they put it out. And it's simple, right? What could go wrong? Unfortunately, a lot can go wrong. So the results are often a mess, and that's because Agile teams work differently. These solicitations often ask for things that no real Agile team would ever do. And because the vendors want the work, they want to win the work, and also because unfortunately some of them don't know any better. They say they know Agile, whatever that means, but I think it's clear once they start delivering, some of them do not. But anyway, they'll go along with it. They're afraid if they don't respond to those requirements, the government will consider them non-compliant and they won't be able to participate. Right? When we're asked to come in and help fix a broken program, one of the first things that we'll do is look at those contracts. It's a great place to start. The vendors will say, we can't do X, even though that's what a good Agile team would do because our contract doesn't allow it. The government may say the same thing. Of course, we can change those contracts, but that does take time. And when we change how the people work by changing these contracts, making them more Agile friendly, not all the staff who were rolled on originally are well suited to work in an Agile environment. Not everybody wants to work that way. It is a different way of working. So we may end up having to change staff as well. This is one of those cases where an ounce of prevention is worth 5 pounds of cure. So I was talking to somebody earlier, I think he may be on the call, where we've agreed over time, if you can get the contracts right, if you can get the acquisitions right, it just makes life so much easier for you down the road. All right. So we thought it'd be fun just to show a top 7 signs of this pixie dust approach. What does it look like? And remember, if you're doing some of these things or even all of them, everybody does some of them. Please don't feel bad. We need to coach people to get better. And the number 7 sign, starting at the bottom, is do you have more than 50 mandated requirements? If so, you may be looking at the pixie dust approach. Do you have a separate testing team? Again, in good Agile, we work a little differently. So if you're asking in your solicitations for a team or awarding to a different vendor to do testing rather than development, you may be looking at this. Do you need change requests to reprioritize and modify scope? We talked about having government staff embedded every day? Are they embedded? Are they contributing? Are they serving as a product owner or product manager for the team? Jonathan talked about market research. Maybe you didn't talk to vendors during market research. Maybe you had RFIs and they responded on paper. This might be a sign we're not doing the interactive collaboration. I love this one. Frequent status reports required. We look at a lot of solicitations. They say you've got to be agile, and they say give us the status reports to prove it. I think Jonathan, it's been a while, but you told a story about eating a sandwich or something, and you don't need a status report after you've just eaten a sandwich to tell you it was good. We've got the government embedded here, right? So they should know what the contractors are delivering. So you don't need to wait for a status report. And then finally, what are we evaluating in the first place? Are we evaluating? Oh, we're right at 3 o'clock. We're about out of time. Are we evaluating the paper response? So Frank, I'm just noticing we're at time.
You mean happy to just let you finish up? I know people are dropping off if they need to. I mean, we can take a little. I mean, Jake, is that correct? Can we take a little additional time here?
Yeah, no problem at all.
Great. All right, proceed.
All right, we'll just take 30 seconds to wrap it up. So speaking of the evaluation, there's no perfect hierarchy, but we wanted to show, typically traditional procurement focus, we're down here. We evaluate a lot of paper. Maybe we've got one-way orals. I've been part of orals where I stood up and spoke for 90 minutes. Nobody asked me any questions. Where we want to get to is more interactive interviews, two-way communication during the process. Jonathan talked about this earlier, where we can observe teams, look at how they interact, look at what they build. And this last one is not always appropriate, depends on the acquisition, but in some cases, we may even collaborate with them on a working product. So with that, let me just wrap it up. I don't know if we have time for questions. I will say we'll email you after this. If you want to copy the slides, we can make those available to you. And Frank, if we do have time for a question or two.
We did have some questions coming in, and Jonathan was kind enough to hammer out some responses there. But I mean, if there are others, we're happy to take them. But I know we are kind of at time, so if anybody's got them, get them in quick, because if we don't see them coming in, we'll go ahead and wind it down. But I want to thank Dave and Jonathan, both of you, for coming on and sharing your insights and expertise and awesome anecdotes with our audience here at Public Spend Forum. So it looks like there's no other questions coming in, so I imagine people are hustling to their next meeting, and I think we should do this again. This was really useful time, and I think we learned a lot.
Yeah, I appreciate you having us on for Public Spend Forum. I appreciate you hosting this, and Dave, thanks for inviting me to join. If you couldn't tell, this is my passion. So my LinkedIn's up here. Happy to have any conversations on this post here. I just enjoy talking about it and sharing my experience. So any discussions after this is welcome.
I'll echo my thanks, Frank. Then we'll wrap it up, and we'll send everybody an email that also has the LinkedIn information, make it a little bit easier for you. And then if you want to register to get the slides, you can do that as well.
Well, fantastic. Well, thank you again. Thanks everybody for joining us. Yeah, we did need more time, and maybe we'll get it. Obviously a dense topic and a lot of variables. So keep doing your best. Try to get agile if you can, and lean on Dave and John, who I know have always been very gracious with their time and energy. So thanks. We're lucky to have you both, and happy afternoon, everybody. Enjoy your day.